Chinese cultural landscapes beliefs really aren't totally different than the Japanese, but it's important to remember that they're not the same thing. The Euro-American concept of Asian is about as relevant as the concept of Euro-American being one thing, as if Finnish and Italians and Americans are somehow, all the same belief logic system. In the Chinese system, what you see is things that both, or actually it's all three, because Korean is also true. All three sort of value or think are important. They sort of get at them in different ways. And so one of the examples of this would be in Japanese society, chi, or in the Hawaiian concept, mana, one of the ways that you deal with that is by minimalization. So you strip all the stuff that's bothering or external out, or you focus on a particular location or a particular entity, and then you sort of, basically would use like meditation or some other format to sort of bond or otherwise tie into that. This is the logic of a Japanese formal garden, for example. It's the logic of the cha, the tea ceremony. But you find this all throughout Japanese society. But the key part here is in some way, shape, or form, you're interacting with nature, or more accurately, interacting with people-modified nature. So this isn't a dominance things like the Calvinists would have had, where you rip out a forest. This is where you get rid of a lot of the trees that aren't relevant, and you keep the one tree that you really want to interact with. Again, think of the temples we've looked at. So that would be the Japanese view of this. Natural, nature-based, and very, very much specific place-based. Oftentimes also tied to visual cues. Japanese are very, very visual. Chinese probably even more so. One of the actually never thought about this, but one of the key aspects to remember about Asian design is there's no context of the difference between the different senses. The idea that vision is different, smell that is different than touch or tactile, really isn't part of Asian design. They see them as a continuum. So it's very typical in Asian design that something that's visual will also have a tactile or audio or some other type of component to it. So it's not, there's not the idea of, like in the Western sense, you have the plastic arts versus, say, music. So you have, things that are substantive versus things that are audio, and they're different. They're considered entirely different. In the Asian context, that wouldn't be the case. So this has a huge impact in design, because if you tie the idea of design into the fact that you can have something that interacts with multiple senses, and you also have this concern or desire to somehow interact with, control, or generate chi, you can see how a lot of, for example, the textures of fabrics, the textures of wood, the way that light catches lacquer, all these type of things are going to be a huge part of Asian design and Asian logic. And a key part of this is they're going to be understood by the majority of people that see it, versus oftentimes when you look at Asian stuff looked at in a Western context, it's sort of seen as the exotic, or it's a very sort of what I would call two-dimensional. Someone looks at the superb quality of Chinese lacquerware without understanding the function of it in terms of what it's actually supposed to do in a logic sense. So Chinese and Japanese Koreans all tend to look at very similar, they have very similar concerns. They sort of go at them in different ways. One thing that Chinese and Koreans have very much in common is they're very, very into the idea of different types of foods having different aspects of qi. And so even a fairly informal Chinese or Korean meal will have different types of foods in the sense that they're seen as having different types of qi. And the end result of all this, going back to what we mentioned last time, is that you want at the end of the meal, you should be in balance. So you should have different types of things that when the end meal is finished, you've actually acquired more qi, you've ingested energy, but it's also a balanced qi versus a, shikui or hakui or some other type of, hot, cold energy or cold, wet energy or something like that. So, even things like food, most famously, of course, in the West would be EID-GE or Qigong, the idea that you actually do exercising or movement as a form of both control of qi and generation of qi. Again, this is very much Korean and Chinese. Japanese walk a lot, but you don't see Japanese exercise the way you do Chinese. If you go to any Chinese city in the morning, You'll see literally hundreds of people in parks, even during COVID, apparently, exercising in a ton of different ways. In Xi'an, for example, we do our work. A real popular thing is these huge wooden, they look like kids' tops, but they're enormous, the size of beach balls. And you'll see old and middle-aged men and women spinning these things on ropes. It's an amazing performance, and yet they're doing it as a form of exercise, but it's also as a focus because you have to pay what attention you're doing, or else you crash into the thing. But it's also a way to generate chi. Very, very typical in Japanese and Korean societies, this idea of everyone does it. In the countryside, in the city, you don't have to be educated. It's just a way that people do things. So you don't see exercise in the way that you do in the United States, where you go to 24-hour fitness because you want to look good. There might be some health aspects to it, but a lot of it's sort of this idea of the external view. So very, very different. So the Chinese, that would be one area. So the way that you're going to look at layout is going to be very much tied to, aspects of movement. But there's also these very complex things of light and texture and other senses that are going to be at play. And this is why when you look at Asian design, especially interior design, especially Chinese design, which I'm most familiar with, it's oftentimes very impressive in the complexity of it, but it's not that most people, especially outsiders, actually really understand what they're seeing. The symbolism and logic entirely misses them. As with the Japanese and the Koreans, there's a huge harmony with nature. Again, the key aspect of this being that people are not superior to nature, people are a part of nature. Chinese tend to play this out very different. In this regard, Korean tends to look a little more like Japanese society. There's a real emphasis on natural fabrics, natural colors, natural textures, natural wood. Chinese are much more into modified. Again, sort of, I think, emphasizing this idea that the Chinese people are very clever animals. So the idea of lacquered, pillars, the idea of lacquered furniture, the idea of silks, woven silks, all this type idea of they're all natural fabrics, and they're not. I don't think the Chinese consider silk, for example, to be man-made. It comes from a silkworm that's woven by people. But the idea that we're part of nature and things that people do are just like a bird building a nest. They're just a manipulation of nature. In all Asian societies, something that comes across, and you see this a lot with the IKEA problem they have in Japan today of abandoned houses, is the transitory nature of existence. I think this is probably one of the really striking things that gets very little discussion, but it's really, really a huge issue in Chinese society. In Asian societies, because you don't have the West Asian concept of heaven and hell, you don't have the idea of a mediating, judging God or heavenly component that's going to put you into either heaven or hell. So you're not going to be going somewhere when you die. In the Asian context, it's very vague. There's very little concept. The creation myth in Asian societies is very lame, by most culture standards, certainly compared to Hawaiian, it's almost non-existent. And it usually just involves more of the discussion of how a particular ancestor came to be. And so what you find is that one of the side aspects of this is, for much of the way that Asians see the world around them, you've only got one life to live. You're not going to, on one hand, there is a concept of reincarnation, but you're not going to be reincarnated as yourself. You're going to be reincarnated as part of some other, like Mark II version or some other version of something. So parts of you are going to be going around. Your memories might go around. But in many ways, Asian existence in the world that we live in is seen as temporary. And this is a huge aspect of every part of Asian design. And again, it goes back to the cyclic nature. In a couple of weeks, we'll have the Cherry Blossom Festival in Japan, and that's considered transitory. They're for, roughly a week and a half. There's this enormous bloom of plum and cherry blossoms, and then they disappear. And on one hand, it's cyclic, it occurs every year. On the other hand, the blooms themselves only last for a week or so. And so this thing is very transitory, it's very temporary. And to a certain extent, sort of ephemeral. And this is the way that Asians view everything of existence. They view human relationships this way. They view our own lives this way. People exist for a period of time and then they cease to exist. And there's not a particular fear of this. It's just sort of a rather pragmatic look at reality. And so in this context, for example, then design is very different because in many ways, the built environment around you provides sort of an anchor to modify the transitory nature of your life. So a home or a house or a building or a temple or whatever is oftentimes seen as sort of an anchor, which allows a collection of different individuals, all who are transitory, all who are temporary, to have a sort of a common place to ground themselves. So one of the aspects, especially in public architecture or sort of monumental architecture in Asia, is the idea of making things non-transitory or less transitory. Something I don't think you see at all in the West, where I think monumental architecture in the West tends to be much more tied to manifestations of political, military, or economic power. Think of Bishop Street, for example. Emptiness is a huge part of Asian design. This is probably most famously seen if you ever look at brush painting or the use of scroll work in Japan, China, and Korea. In Japan and Korea, a lot of this would be, for example, calligraphy. Well, China also, but especially in all three cultures, the idea of landscapes, where you'll find that very frequently, if you look at a traditional landscape scroll in Asia, you'll find that large parts of the scroll don't have anything in them. They're just blank rice paper. And this is intentional. Emptiness or lack of something, oftentimes called wa in Japanese, is actually a part of design. So, for example, if you're designing a room, you'll leave empty parts of it. That's actually part of the design of a room. There's not this need to fill things in. Something that is absent is actually, absence is a thing. Absence isn't a lack of. This is probably the biggest difference between Asian and Euro-American design. Euro-American design doesn't have a concept of emptiness as being part of design. Emptiness is usually seen as, well, you forgot something, or maybe it's a transitory. This is a zone from one area to another. But in Asian design, emptiness is a critical part of design, and it's actually a very, very important design element in all aspects of Asian design. And I think it's sort of hard for folks outside of Asian logics to sort of see emptiness as actually a part of the design, fabric, if you want to think of it that way. Like its Shinto counterparts, Taoism is your Chinese, sort of place-based religion, and it's a belief system, and it follows, very much a similar thing. So I'm not going to bother going into a lot of detail. Probably the key one for our purposes is, again, a lot of it's very, very, very place-specific. Again, think of those land god things, images that I showed you for Zhongshan in China. One of the interesting aspects that the Chinese do that Japanese don't. My understanding of Japanese religious belief systems is they don't really have a strong concept of heaven. You very rarely see it referred to. Japanese almost invariably refer to ancestors, but where the ancestors are sort of vaguely here but not here. Chinese, on the other hand, have a very clear definition of what heaven is, but it's not really clear what people's relationship with heaven is. One of the really interesting aspects of Chinese society that the Koreans also have is that heaven is a perfect version of Earth, or if you want to counter that, Earth is a real knockoff, cheap version of heaven. And so gods, various other spirits, even ancestors live in heaven. And that's in the Chinese concept, that's the Jade Emperor's heaven. The Jade Emperor is seen as a sort of overarching authority who manages or runs heaven. His human counterpart traditionally would have been the Chinese emperor, in terms of the guy living in Xi'an or Beijing or whatever. But the difference would be that the living emperor, what we would consider reality emperor, was part of a flawed system. He was flawed. Human architecture is flawed. Everything about the world we live in is flawed. It's like a really cheap knockoff, $20 iPhone bad copy of heaven. And so the Jade Emperor manages heaven in the sense of this place where everything's in great shape, perfect. Having said that, the things in heaven, the gods, including the Jade Emperor himself, still are subject to all the behavioral issues that people have. In this regard, it's very similar to the Greeks. I'm not sure if the Greeks, I'm not really that familiar with the Greek concept of whether heaven was perfect versus imperfect earth. But certainly the idea of Greek gods going after each other and, having attitude in the whole nine yards. Chinese totally would see this. And if you ever read Sun Wukong, the Journey to the West or Monkey King. You see this classically played out. It's the major theme of the entire, enormous epic is the whole imperfection of not only humans, but actually also the imperfection of heaven and the things in heaven. So one of the interesting aspects you see this in a Chinese concept would be how if you're, for example, a carpenter or an artist or something like that, you're never going to strive to make the perfect something. You're always going to strive to make something close. And if you're really good at it, you'll try to make something that's so close to perfect that anyone who doesn't know better will think it is. But you're never going to try to make something perfect because that's the prerogative of heaven. And you can't do that. Now, one of the other ways that this plays out then is then symmetry is also limited to heaven and gods. So you're never going to try to make something symmetrical. And one of the key aspects that you notice when you start to look at Asian designs is the asymmetry of it. Especially probably more visibly in Korean and Chinese design. Japanese do this, but they're not, the logic isn't as deeply embedded in there in the way that they sort of view the world around them. But in Chinese and Korean societies, traditionally, and actually still largely today, symmetry is not something that people strive for. And more importantly, symmetry isn't something people are particularly comfortable with. And saying something is perfect is sort of like asking for it. In this regard, I believe that the Greeks had the same attitude towards perfection. It seems to me that a bunch of Greek stories that deal with people on earth trying to be perfect and the gods punishing them for that. So let's take some images that sort of give you some ideas of how this plays out. Okay, since I stopped with that, here's the first image. This is a fretwork window frame in Suzhou, which is the sort of oftentimes called the Chinese Venice. It's about 80 miles away from Shanghai. It's on a lake. It's a very, very beautiful city. Large sections are largely intact from the last, 500, 800 years ago. We'll see a couple of images from there. This is sort of a classic example of the whole mess of these design logics. So working out from the interior of the humble administrator's tea house, which the guy was like the prime minister of China. So it's very typically calls himself humble administrator, basically ran the country. So this is an example of very, very elitist interior architecture design in a Chinese concept. This dates from the Ming Dynasty, so it'd be about 1500s. So it's about 400 or 500 years old. So here's a frame. The frame is, and there's several aspects that are very, very Chinese and very design oriented here. One is that you've got this very complicated, unnecessary fretwork. What this does is this breaks up the view with the outside, and that's very intentional. Notice how on one hand, it looks very symmetrical. If you were to actually measure it though, what you'll find is that actually the distance, for example, in this piece here to its counterpart on the other side of the window is slightly off. Now, it's not because the guy didn't know what he was doing. He knew exactly what he was doing. It's just that pure symmetry or real perfect symmetry is not something that people are supposed to strive for. So the woodworker that made this frame intentionally made it very, very, very slightly asymmetrical. Now, to the guy that paid for it, the prime minister that paid for this, he wouldn't know, and to be honest, he wouldn't care. I suppose at some point, if he really thought about it, he would know that was built in, but it's sort of a game that the guy that did it so well that you can't see it, but you have a comfort that it's there. So there's a very, very small hidden amount of asymmetry in that to keep the gods from getting pissed off, to keep heaven from getting pissed off. The fact that you've got a view, very short framework of view, because basically got the other wing of the same building right here. But what you do is you throw bamboo out there. Now that's, bamboo is typical in Asia. It's a very handy landscaping device because it stays green year round, though it does vary from season to season in terms of how much leafing you see. So what you see here is a very green. You've got, again, a human part up here. And again, this is intentional. You don't necessarily want a view of nature. You want a view of the clever things that you paid for, since it's your house. And also the fact that people are manipulating this. So on one hand, you can grow bamboo. This was obviously planted here. On the other thing, if you know anything about bamboo, pretty quickly you might start growing it, but it's pretty much going to do its own thing. So this is this is intentionally not done like you would see in the West. If you go to our campus, you'll see everything is squared off. So you see hedges, classic American, even more so than Europeans, trimmed hedges, squared hedges, rectangular, whatever. This would all be trimmed. You'd have gardeners out here a couple of times a week making this thing nice and symmetrical and people controlled. In a Chinese concept, people planted this, people are taking care of it, but you also let it do what it's doing. Having said that, there's probably some Chinese gardeners that are actually trimming this sucker to make it look this natural. So it's a contrived naturalness. You've got a roof system here that's not glazed. You've got a very complex system of roof framing here. And again, you've got your lacquered, interior framing here with your glass. So this is a very Chinese, very sophisticated, sort of example of the relationship people have with nature. They're not superior to it. They're not trying to dominate nature, but they are trying to be comfortable and manipulate it to their advantage. This is one of the areas I think outside of even China, I don't think people really understand this. This is another garden. I don't remember the name of this garden, to be honest, sorry. But it's from the same period. This is late Ming Dynasty, so I think it's the roughly late 1500s, 1570, I think, or something like that. So again, this garden's been around for about 500 years. It shows a bunch of aspects that are very, very typical in the Chinese use of design. If you look very carefully here, you notice that the walkway isn't of one thing. You've got laid pebbles and mortar. You've got large slabs of stone pebbles. You've got a very, very complicated walkway and fretway down here. You've got a lot of different stuff going on, very, very busy. This is intentional because you have to remember in Asia, people tend to walk around either in wooden clogs, and like the gate to the Japanese use, or in China, you tend to use felt slippers traditionally, which means that you can feel the surface you're on. So one of the aspects of this is that you don't want a smooth, even surface. You want an even one that changes texture, because that makes people pay attention to the world that they're in. Because again, this is a garden you're supposed to pay attention to. You're not supposed to be wandering through here on your phone. You're supposed to be paying attention to that. One of the more exotic aspects, if you notice these strange stone features here, these are limestones taken from somewhere around Guilin or Fuzhou. I can't remember exactly where, but there's some place in part of China where this stuff occurs naturally. These are actually considered works of natural art. So these things were moved at great expense from basically South Central China up here to sort of Northeast Central China. And I suspect even in modern China, this particular one of these two pieces probably would set you back hundreds of thousands of dollars US, even today. So what you've got is natural rock as art. So these are art pieces that are intentionally placed here. The smaller pieces are from the same area. So someone went to a huge amount of work to make, well, yeah, I suppose for lack of a better term, we would call it rock garden for meditative purposes. These things are seen as, not surprisingly, Hawaiians, would make perfect sense in a Hawaiian context. These things have handled a lot of chi. One of the aspects of Chinese aesthetics is you're not supposed to modify these. So it's considered totally inappropriate to carve them, modify, or do anything to them. This has to be what they were when you, quote, found them, unquote. So these actually have names. I can never remember what the names are, but all these pieces, I think there's 8 in this garden, and they're all named. It's considered the largest collection of these outside of the Beijing Forbidden Palace, which has a huge, massive collection of 14, which none of them are as nice. So again, here, when you look at the aesthetics, you've got trees. You don't have too much landscaping here because you don't want to distract from the function of the stones. So these are both chi generators, and by moving through here, you're actually doing a form of exercise. So you're not only stabilizing yourself and centering yourself and balancing yourself, but you're also getting chi. So the vegetation is supposed to enhance that and complement it, but it's not supposed to dominate it. And so if you notice, the architecture again is actually pretty. I don't know if refined is the right word, but it's pretty low key, because you don't want anything to get in the way of what your main function is here, which is to pay attention to the rock features. So again, a very, very unique part of Chinese design. Japanese don't tend to use rocks the same way. One of the earlier Korean dynasties was very into rock formations, but I don't think in the later periods it survived. Last, though, it's a little bit of a tangent, but it gives you the idea of this relationship of people in heaven. This is the part of the Forbidden City in Beijing. This was the imperial capital from the 1600s, basically the Qing dynasty, 1614 to 1911. And this is the central part of it. So at Chinese New Year's, this became the most important spot in the entire Chinese empire, this sort of wedding cake looking round structure. And so this is where the emperor right at New Year's, as the moon's rising, what's the small moon's rising at the start of the new year. Because you have to remember, New Year's is a lunar logic in Asia, as in much of the world. So the emperor would come up here with his entourage attached to him, but the emperor has to single himself march up here because the emperor his main title in Chinese was Son of Heaven. So the Chinese emperor was seen as the son, or maybe great grandson of the Jade Emperor in heaven. There's a whole complicated logic. We don't have time to go in this semester, but in this class. But nonetheless, basically, he was supposed to come up here and PR as quote dad unquote in heaven. So he was supposed to walk up here. This all would have been torchlight. It would have been very spectacular. And he was supposed to walk up to here and walk up this particular structure. And they never had anything on top. This is all the structure that you see here. And he would go to the top. I'll flip back then because I'm not sure I remember to put the images in. So at the top of that weird circular structure is this, very polished granite thing, just a big flat granite circular thing. In the middle of it is this little tiny, relatively speaking, button. And in modern China, this is a huge thing to do what the guy's doing where you stand on the button. Now, actually, he didn't stand on the button. The emperor would have stood, to one side of it. The button was seen as the point at which the world, i.e. our reality, connects to the Jade Emperor's reality in heaven, which was seen as somehow being sort of up somewhere. So in that regard, I suppose sort of like the Judeo-Christian idea of heaven being out there. And so this was the point of contact where basically the Jade Emperor would, if you would, call his dad, the emperor in Beijing would call his dad, the Jade Emperor, and give him offerings and thank him for last year and ask him to help him through the next year. This was actually one of the main functions of the emperor in Chinese society. The main function of the emperor was to PR for everyone with heaven, i.e. the Jade Emperor, because he was the Jade Emperor's relative. To a certain extent, this logic is exactly the same in Japan. The Japanese emperor, his main function is to interact with Amaterasu, the Japanese sun goddess, who is the protector of Japan. But he's her great generation's grandchild, over 2,000 years now. And so his reason for existence, the reason people let him be in charge, is he's still supposed to interact with heaven to the extent that no one else can because they're not relatives. Again, think it's sort of like the concept of clan. Chinese is a little more flaky because the Chinese don't really have the concept of clan tied to the Jade Emperor. But nonetheless, if you are the emperor on Earth, you are supposed to interact with the Jade Emperor, and this becomes it's a fascinating piece of architecture because to non-Chinese, I don't think it would make any sense at all. There's no structure here. There's nothing around it. There's just this flat slab with what looks like a really large, granite button in the middle of it. And yet that is the spot in which heaven interacts with Earth. And so it was and still is a very important location. Now it's just, of course, of social interest to Chinese, but back in the day, of course, it was the most ritually important spot, much more so than any temple or other location in China. And just quickly, this is the image that I hope it showed up, but just in case it didn't, this is the Suzhou garden image with the exotic stone formations. Most famously, what you find is all this sort of ties together, especially in the Chinese concept. We had a very strong, really powerful concept of the bureaucracy, but most importantly of education. Being educated and knowledgeable was throughout Chinese society even today was the standard of the goal of people. Power was not as important as education. Power was always temporary. Again, remember this transitory nature of existence. This is probably the area where Japanese society is totally different than Chinese and Korean society. Japanese society very early on gets very tied into this idea of military prowess, most famously seen in the samurai, but more accurately in daimyo, and then the idea of military power. You have the concept of education that becomes the imperial family and the imperial centers of Nara and later Kyoto. But what you find is military power and military prowess becomes sort of the watchword for what's the most important stuff right down to 1945, actually. In Chinese Korean society, what you find is there's a downplaying of the idea of military and even economic power. What's really important is education. And so being educated is absolutely central in Chinese and Korean society if you want to be sophisticated, you want to be anything. So, the fact that prime minister's fretwork window, he called himself the humble administrator. So what he's trying to emphasize is his education, not the fact that he ran the entire country. very different than what you'd see in the Euro-American, where power and wealth and all this becomes absolutely central. In Chinese and Korean society, education was central, and so exhibiting that education, that sophistication, was absolutely key to social status and prestige and even self-identity. As we'll see, this plays out then, because what you do is, as part of the Chinese Korean concept, is you get very heavily involved in trying to basically make sense of qi. And that becomes what we'll see as next time we look at things like feng shui and meng shui.